Our presenter today, this is Carl Linvill, principal with RAP, who's speaking. And I'm going to be handing off to Jim Lazar in just a moment. Jim is an economist with RAP. He's a senior advisor to RAP. For most of his 30 years, he has served as an expert witness for state consumer advocates, low-income advocates, environmental advocates, and utility regulators. He specializes in rate design issues, but he's worked extensively on resource planning, incentive regulation, and revenue requirement analyses as well. So Jim, I'm going to hand it over to you to start with your presentation.
This is Jim Lazar. Yeah. I want to check and make sure my video is right on slide 4. Is that good?
Yep, that's great, Jim.
Okay,
take it away.
So I'm missing the GoToMeeting control block on my screen for some reason, so I don't have that. So what is a duck curve? A duck curve is a term that was kind of created in California. I think actually San Diego Gas and Electric was the first to use it, but it describes how utilities load changes over time as more and more solar and in some cases wind are added to it. But the solar is the big player that reduces the amount of load to be served by the utilities' controllable generation during the middle of the day, but doesn't have any impact whatsoever on the load to be served by the utility at the end of the day. So you wind up with this sagging belly in the middle of the day and a sharp ramp into a steep neck taking the form of a duck. Why is this an issue? Solar helps meet the daytime load. The loads still rise in the evening, and it can be compounded by wind coming and going. How do utilities manage this now? Well, they manage it with controllable generation, in this case, a natural gas-fired power plant. But, you know, ducks can fly, right? So a duck in water has very much the shape of the California ISO graphic. The fat body floats, and the tall neck is there to breathe and to watch out for predators. But in flight, a duck has a completely different profile. It stretches out its body and straightens its neck in order to reduce wind resistance. So as you heard when you first tuned in, if you got here a minute early, our job is to straighten this duck out so it can fly right. This paper has 10 strategies to align loads to resources and to align resources to loads. And what we've done is use illustrative values for each. We've started with a hypothetical utility in California and then applied the strategies one at a time. The 10 strategies are targeted energy efficiency, peak-oriented renewables, managing water pumping loads, grid-integrated electric water heating, storage air conditioning, rate design changes, electricity storage in key locations, demand response, interregional power exchanges, and the retirement of inflexible older generating units. And it's important to stress that our values are illustrative, and not every strategy will be applicable to every utility. Obviously, an island utility isn't going to have interregional power exchanges available to it. The objective is to start with the load shape at the top. This is our illustrative utility before the strategies. The blue line at the top is the total load of the utility. The green line is the we'll call it the post-solar load, the load net of wind and solar, the load to be served by controllable resources. And by the time we get to the end, we'll have pushed up the belly and pushed down the head, and our load shape will have a very different character, and in fact will be flatter than the pre-solar load, so easier to serve. So strategy 1 is targeted energy efficiency. There's a lot of energy efficiency that occurs during where the benefits are concentrated in those ramping hours in the early evening. Kitchen lighting is a very good example of this, but ground source heat pumps are another that dramatically reduce air conditioning loads in the evening. There are quite a few different kinds of targeted energy efficiency, and good utilities that have sophisticated integrated resource plans measure the value of the energy efficiency resources across the months and across the time period. The Northwest Power Council's models have 4 different time periods and 12 different months, so they have 48 different points at which they measure the load shape of energy efficiency. This energy efficiency will tend to lower loads at all hours. But the savings are concentrated in the peak periods because we've targeted measures that have a majority or the largest part of their savings in those peak periods. The second strategy is peak-oriented renewables, and this is one that we replaced one of the original strategies in the original paper. There are late afternoon wind resources available. This graphic shows an example in blue of a wind resource in New Mexico that happens to peak in the early evening, as opposed to the red line, which is the typical wind pattern of West Texas wind, which tends to peak a few hours later after the utility peak load is passed. Hydro redispatch is another major one. Many utilities around the country have some amount of hydroelectric resources. They can typically have a limited amount of water available behind those dams, that they can't run them at full power all day and all night. There are some run-of-the-river dams where they do run them constantly, but most dams have some pondage or storage and a limited number of hours they can be run. And then in the first edition, we talked about solar thermal and west-facing solar. We found that those are less valuable than we had originally anticipated. This is a small benefit. We didn't assume very much from this, but it has the effect of raising loads to the utility in the early part of the day and reducing them in the late afternoon. So it helps bring the head of the duck down a little bit. The third is managing water loads. Water loads are about 7% of national electricity usage. Some of this is on the top is water supply, pumping loads to get water into tanks or for irrigation. Those pump, and some of it is in wastewater treatment at the bottom. And these are quite different. Both of them, however, have storage. Most water systems pump water up into a tank or reservoir and then use gravity to let that water serve the eventual houses and businesses that it goes to. You can pump that water up when you need to within the constraints of the reservoir. It may make sense to actually augment the tanks and the reservoirs. It may be cheaper to store energy in the form of water reservoirs or tanks. In the wastewater systems tend to have their peak demands in winter when rain and other stormwater comes into the system. In the summer, they're often running at a relatively low level of capacity. They have enough storage to be able to, in some cases, shift some of their major processes into key hours and out of key hours to augment, to help the utility meet its loads. So the load after strategy 3, are we on track to slide 17, folks? Carl?
Yes.
Okay. I'm having some glitches here, but apparently they're not affecting the rest of the world. Load after strategy 3, the head has come down a little bit, the belly has gone up a little bit. We're making progress. Strategy 4 is a big one, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time with this one. It's water heating. Electric water heating is about 14% of residential usage nationally. Every water heater is, in effect, a thermal battery. It stores a whole bunch of energy in the form that we're eventually going to use it, hot water. The idea behind grid-integrated water heating is to heat the water when the power is cheap and use it as necessary. Here I've got a graphic of a variable capacity grid interactive water heater patented by Sequentric, which has just signed a contract to deploy a whole bunch of these in the middle part of the country. It has 3 elements instead of 2. The upper 2 elements operate as a conventional water heater. The bottom element comes on whenever the utility or the grid operator causes it to, so that they can stuff power into the water heater when it's surplus and curtail that water heater if the upper part of the tank is providing adequate service to the customer and the grid needs some relief. Now, there's 45 million electric water heaters in the U.S. They're concentrated in the South, the Northwest, and Hawaii, but every part of the country has a significant amount. It's very common. About 75% of apartments have electric water heaters. And even in California, where our illustrative utility is, about 10% of customers have electric water heaters. So there's some clever things that people are learning to do with grid-integrated water heating. This is a graphic from Stethis Corporation showing how it is able to both charge an electric water heater during the solar day, but also follow the grid operator's need for higher or lower load from second to second as clouds come and go and the solar output varies a little bit. They can vary the load of the water heaters literally from second to second to follow, in this case, solar output. But what they've shown here is they've charged the water heater during the solar day on the left side of the chart, and then the rest of it is from 6 at night until the next morning. Almost no electricity needs to flow into this group of water heaters at all. That is, they have enough hot water stored to last almost all of the customers all the way through to the next morning. There's a little bit of power being flowed into the water heaters to make sure nobody runs out of hot water, and I'll talk about that. Yes, it also works with heat pump water heaters. This is something that General Electric has tested, putting 100 heat pump water heaters into a group of 1,000 homes. Before the heat pump water heaters went in, the load of these group of customers followed the blue line. Afterwards, it followed the red line. The blue line is the grid demand of 1,000 homes, and that's the effect after they put 100 heat pump water heaters in and controlled those water heaters so that they were charging during the middle of the solar day or in the middle of the night, but not during the peak loads in the afternoons. And GE now sells an 80-gallon heat pump water heater that can comfortably carry almost any family through a peak use period. It's there's a very important rule in the grid-integrated water heating world, and that's no cold showers. And I ran a test of what would happen in Maui if we converted all of the condominium water heaters, and there's thousands and thousands of them there. I estimated 13,000. So that they were charging in the middle of the solar day and charging in the middle of the night and then discharging hot water as people used it. And what I found is that we needed less than half of the storage in those water heaters. That is, on average, the tanks were still half full of hot water, measured in kilowatt hours of the usable storage in the tank at the end of the peak period when charging was curtailed. There's a new report out that was published by the National Rural Electric Co-ops Association, the Natural Resource Defense Council, and the Peak Load Management Association. It was written for them by Rattle Group. And it shows that the four different approaches to water heating. Peak shaving, just turning off the water heaters during peak hours, had some positive net value. But using them for thermal storage, that is, charging them in the middle of the day with solar or the middle of the night, had economic value. That heat pump water heaters, controlled or uncontrolled, had economic value. But the most value came when you combined peak shaving, thermal storage, and what's called fast response. That is, using the water heaters controlled on a minute-to-minute and second-to-second basis to provide frequency regulation and voltage support to the utility. There's a huge national potential. The average use per water heater, according to U.S. Energy Information Administration, over 4,000 kilowatt hours a year. That's equal to the annual output of about 2.2 kW of wind or solar. We multiply that by 45 million water heaters, we've got about 100,000 megawatts of wind or solar that we could take into the system and store their energy until we need it in the water heaters. A little more complicated than that, but we only have currently about 75,000 megawatts of wind and solar on the U.S. grid. So this one resource alone could quite possibly allow us to double our wind and solar capability and manage that the system with the flexibility that we need just from this one resource. It's a biggie. But because our illustrative utility is in California, they have only about, it's the lowest saturation of electric water heating anywhere in the country. It has a pretty minor effect on our illustrative utility, but in Hawaii or the Pacific Northwest or the South, this would be a much, much larger impact on the load shape. So we're going to take a little break here for clarifying questions.
Jim, there's one clarifying question so far, and there's a request to clarify whether you're referencing solar PV or solar thermal charging of the domestic water heater.
Solar PV charging of the domestic water heater. The assumption here is that what we're trying to adapt to is a grid that has a lot of solar PV coming onto the grid as people install both grid scale and distributed solar systems throughout throughout the utility system.
Okay, I think that's our only clarifying question so far, so let's keep going.
All right. Strategy 5 is another biggie. Air conditioning storage. Air conditioning is about 30% of peak utility demand in the U.S. This is a graphic from Texas comparing the loads by customer class on a 64-degree day in Dallas to a 109-degree day in Dallas. The residential load quadruples. The commercial load doubles. The large commercial and industrial load increases by a couple thousand megawatts. There's a lot of different ways to get at the air conditioning load and incorporating storage into air conditioning. One is through appliance standards, that is, new air conditioners would have to include storage. One would be through utility service standards, where utilities say we do not serve air conditioners over a certain size unless they contain storage. And the third would be retrofit incentives, where the utility provides financial incentives through its public benefits program to assist customers in installing storage in air conditioning. Now, we can store cool as ice, and in fact, most of us already do. If you have an ice maker in your fridge at home, it sits there and makes about 12 ice cubes an hour all day and all night, and you can use up to 288 ice cubes a day whenever you need them. And ice storage air conditioning isn't a whole lot more sophisticated than that. For small buildings, there's a company, Ice Energy, makes a product called the Ice Bear. It is a unitary air conditioner and ice storage system. It's designed as a direct replacement for a conventional rooftop air conditioning package unit that we find on, every mini mart in America, every strip mall in America, and most of the big box stores in America. There's literally millions of places where these would be a direct replacement. There are other companies getting into the space of serving the package air conditioning market. There's a whole different set of technologies that are used in large buildings, such as this skyscraper in New York, where they install a separate, called an ice bank, separate storage tanks. And there are several companies that are in this space competing for the central chiller markets. The biggest one that I'm aware of in the U.S. is Austin Energy, the electric utility operated by the city of Austin. It has a district cooling system that serves a large group of large commercial buildings. And the electric utility operates this district cooling system. Instead of selling people electricity in their own air conditioners, it sells them chilled water to run into their air conditioning systems. And this system consumes about 15 megawatts during the day until noon, and then they're done making ice and they shut off the chillers, and the only loads they have that you see there between noon and at 8 p.m. are the pumps and the fans to move the cool around. And then in the evening, when the wind comes up and the loads go down, they begin recharging ice. Austin Energy has found both a way to reduce their peak demand by 15 megawatts and to augment their evening demand. And in Texas, sometimes the prices go very, very low at night, and they've got a place to put that low-cost energy. Sometimes the prices even go negative in Texas on windy nights. Strategies 4 and 5, water heating and air conditioning storage, are very expensive compared with other kinds of storage. This is a graphic that we took from Sandia National Labs that shows in the peach color different kinds of batteries, lead acid, nickel, cadmium, and lithium ion. The vertical axis is how much it costs in capital cost per kilowatt hour that you can store. And the horizontal axis is the capital cost per kilowatt of peaking capacity that the batteries can supply to the system. And these are concentrated, between $100 and $1,000 a kilowatt hour, and between $300 and $3,000 per peak kilowatt. When we add water heaters and chilled water and thermal ice storage into this, they both come in at the low end of both the capital cost per kilowatt hour and the capital cost per kW end of the scale. Basically, storing energy in the form we are eventually going to use it is cheaper than storing it in a battery and putting it in as electricity and taking it back out as electricity and then using it for the purpose that we're eventually going to use it. So this is a pretty substantial strategy for a California utility where there is a fair amount of air conditioning, and we've brought the head of the duct down quite a bit and added some load in other parts of the day to meet the air conditioning load without having to run the chillers, so all of the chillers in the late afternoon. Strategy 6 is rate design. This is a big topic nationally right now. This first one is the residential rate design. This is taken from our publication, Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future. And it changes the residential rate design to a customer charge that reflects only billing and collection costs, a connection charge, a peak capacity charge to cover the transformers, because those have to be able to carry the load of individual customers. Even a solar customer that net meters to zero needs to have a transformer that's large enough to carry their load from the utility at night and their power exported to the utility during the daytime. But then we move the energy charges into an off-peak, mid-peak, on-peak, and critical peak format. And I'll talk about the critical peak part of this in a moment. Customers can understand this kind of a rate design, they can respond to it, and the evidence is that they actually respond very well. We published a paper, Time Varying and Dynamic Rate Design, a couple of years ago. We looked at 109 different pilot programs of time of use rates, peak time rebates, critical peak pricing, a few examples of real-time pricing, and then we looked at those that had technology, things like Nest thermostats or air conditioning, cycling, or water heater controls coupled with them. And what we found was that compared to a flat rate, the time of use rates produced a 5 to 10% peak load reduction. If you added technology to that, it went up into the 10 to 20% range. But the critical peak pricing rates produced 10 to 20% peak load reduction without technology, and 20 to even as much as 50% peak load reduction for the customers involved in these pilots, with automated technology to help them respond to those critical peak prices. It is a very, very effective residential rate design, and more utilities are moving in this direction, but many are not. Sacramento did a very sophisticated pilot, several thousand customers, including about 1,000 low-income customers, and they found that every group of customers did respond to the critical peak price, that the vast majority preferred it to the traditional rate design. And when they asked them, what did you actually do, they got very clear answers. About 80% did their laundry off-peak. About 70% turned off lights during the critical hours. About 60% did dishes off-peak. About half of the customers turned off the air conditioners, and about half of the customers adjusted the thermostat settings on the air conditioner. So almost everybody responded to those critical events, which in Sacramento occurred on hot afternoons, by adjusting their air conditioning consumption. Customers actually do things in response to that. Now I'm going to turn to commercial rate design. On the left side, I have a pretty typical commercial rate design of, a $10 a month customer charge, a $10 a non-coincident demand charge, and a 10-cent a kilowatt hour energy charge. What I've done on the right is I've taken $8 out of the demand charge and recovered that part of the revenue requirement during the key hours for teaching the duck to fly to flatten out the load, 7 to 10 a.m. and 4 to 9 p.m. During all other hours, the rate stays the same. The nice thing about this is there's no hour at which customers see a lower price than they did before. But during the peak and critical peak hours, they see a higher price. And some customers will not respond. I'm not expecting a law firm that bills $400 an hour for their people to go adjusting the thermostats too much. They may just pay the bill. But an awful lot of companies, if you're operating a dry cleaning plant, you may choose to wrap up your dry cleaning operation by 4 o'clock in order to avoid incurring the higher costs in those hours. The rate design has a pretty substantial impact on the shape of our duck. The head has come down, the belly has gone up. Strategy 7 is electricity storage, batteries. Batteries are a phenomenal technology. Their costs are coming down. The uses for them are expanding. More and more utilities are buying them. What we found is that they really need to do double duty or triple duty to be cost effective. In the case of an electric vehicle charger, we've just finished a paper on a little while ago on electric vehicle charging. And one of the things that we recommend is that the electric vehicle chargers either be programmed to a time of use rate or be directly controllable by the utility or grid operator, so that they provide the customer the charge they need at the lowest possible cost while providing the grid relief it needs. Now in the future we may see car batteries actually able to backfeed to the grid, what's called vehicle to grid or V2G. But I'm now going to talk a little bit about sort of the grid scale batteries that you see here on the left. Kauai Island Utility Cooperative is on track to achieve 50% renewables, mostly solar, by 2023. And this isn't very clear. It's a picture that I got of a screenshot of somebody's computer, but it shows that here at the green line at the top was the frequency on the grid, and then a unit tripped off, a generating unit tripped off, and the operation of the two batteries below immediately kicked in, and within literally a matter of seconds had brought the green line, the system frequency, back up to 60 cycles. So they're using their batteries for spinning reserve. In addition, they're using them for solar integration. This shows how the output of a group from a solar farm varies actually from minute to minute as clouds come and go, and how on the bottom, how the battery energy storage system absorbs the fluctuations in the output of the solar system. So here you get Kauai actually doing triple duty with their batteries. They're using them for storing power generated from solar during the day to use at night. They're using it for spinning reserve, and they're using it for minute-to-minute solar integration and system stabilization as they go, getting triple duty out of their batteries. Now, we didn't put a lot of batteries in because they're frankly a very generally inexpensive strategy, but if you can find places where they can do double or triple duty, they're quite beneficial. Strategy 8 is demand response. That is power companies or grid operators requesting customers curtail electricity and paying them for doing so, often through demand response aggregators. In the middle, there are a number of companies that do that. And initially, this was occurring primarily for industrial facilities. We're now seeing it expanded to commercial facilities, and Maryland in particular has, with their peak time rebate rates, has achieved a great deal of demand response in the residential class. We've surveyed customers. About 9% are already using demand response services in the commercial and industrial sector. Another quarter are very interested. Another 40% are moderately interested, and some are not interested. We're not going to get every customer to participate in a demand response program. We did not assume very much demand response in teaching the duck to fly, simply because the rate design changes and the targeted energy efficiency measures we thought would already have captured a fair amount of what is normally marketed as demand response. We wanted to make sure we weren't double counting any of the savings that we've done. So this is just by virtue of it being number 7. We're showing it shaving a little bit of peak demand in the afternoon, but we've assumed that all of the augmentation that pushes the belly of the duck up has already occurred in response to the time varying rates and the other strategies. This brings us to strategy 9. This is the one that is most location specific. Most major transmission lines were built to connect baseload power plants in remote areas to the service territory, and secondarily to facilitate economy and energy exchanges. For example, the connections from the Pacific Northwest to California were originally built to export surplus hydro in the spring to California. But they're also useful for peak diversity exchanges. This is a map of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power's interconnections to Oregon, to Nevada, to Utah, and to Arizona. The Pacific Northwest has a very different shape of load than California does. That diversity is important. This shows total consumption month by month for California, peaking in the summer, July, August, September, and for Washington and Oregon, peaking in December, January, and February. Well, it turns out California's peaks are in the afternoons in the summer, and the Northwest's peaks are in the morning in the winter. These two regions that have had a very long history of economy and energy transactions are now beginning to move into much more in the way of time of day transactions, and basically allowing the capacity in the Northwest to serve California in the summer and capacity in California to serve the Northwest in the winter. Depending on region, this can be a pretty big value. Since we're talking about an illustrative California utility here, we assume quite substantial potential benefit from interregional exchanges. In other parts of the country, it might be less, although there's a new paper that was recently released by NOAA, the National Oceanographic Administration, Atmospheric Administration, that suggested that a national grid of DC interties would allow for much, much higher renewable resource levels across the country by taking advantage of the load diversity. And the last of our strategies is to retire inflexible older generating units. Older steam units, and it doesn't matter whether they're gas or coal or nuclear, tend to have minimum load restrictions. That is, you can't turn them down below about 30% at night, or else you can't get them to come back up to full power the next day. And it varies from plant to plant and technology to technology, but this limitation forces utilities to run them even at hours when the generation isn't needed. By contrast, the newest natural gas combined cycle flex units are designed to be shut down overnight. In some parts of the country, this is forcing prices to zero or negative. Texas is experiencing negative prices. The Pacific Northwest in the spring experiences negative prices. Germany has experienced prices. In others, where there's not a wholesale market to control, it's forcing curtailment of renewables. This slide shows the total wind output of 3 wind farms in Maui in 2015, and in red, it shows the output of those farms that was curtailed by the utility, actually feathered the props of the propellers of the wind turbines because the utility could not accept that power. Just as in the presentation I gave last week at a conference, I showed that just controlling the electric water heaters in Maui in the condominiums would allow about half of this energy to be accepted into the system. Just that one single strategy 4 here. Now, there are a lot of retirements planned by utilities, and most of those that are planned are older and less flexible units. On the left side here was the expected level of retirements without the Clean Power Plan, 86,000 megawatts of natural gas and coal plants expected to be retired. Now, if the Clean Power Plant is upheld, that number goes up, but the point is that there's an expectation that older, less flexible power plants will be retired. I know I've been working for about 40 years, and I'm about ready to retire, so it seems only natural to me that these power plants should be. This brings us to the end result of our arithmetic exercise. The first column here was the total load without renewables or the strategies. That is before solar. The system had a 73.6% daily load factor and 1,800 megawatts of total ramp during the day. The next was the net load with the renewables, but without the strategies. The ramping requirement went up, the maximum hourly ramp went up, the load factor went down. The third column is the first edition strategies, and the fourth column is the second edition strategies. The point here is that before the renewables and before the strategies, we had a 73% load factor and an 1,800 megawatt difference between the highest and lowest hour for our illustrative utility. With the strategies, that daily load factor is now 86.5% on the remaining resources. The highest hour is only 1/3 the increase compared to the lowest hour that it was before. We have dramatically flattened out the duck. And we now quickly go through the strategies of energy efficiency and water pumping and water heating and air conditioning and rate design and demand response and interregional power exchanges. Eventually we get to the point that our duck is ready to fly. And with that, we will take questions until the top of the hour. We'll end the formal webinar there, but we'll stay on the line and keep answering questions as long as it makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jim. That was great. So I'm going to start with a few clarifying questions. First of all, one person asked if the air conditioning with ice storage uses water. So in desert climates that are short on water, is there a concern over additional water use with that?
No, the ice tanks use the same water over and over again. They freeze them and they melt them and they freeze them and they melt them. So it's not a water consumption factor at all.
Okay. Question about the time-varying critical peak pricing slide that you had that showed the different, from the previous RAP publication. What does each vertical bar represent in the time-varying rate slide? There you go.
In this slide, the vertical bar is the peak load reduction that was achieved. It's the average peak reduction from each of these pilots. 109 different pilots, about 20 of them with time of use rates, 10 time of use with technology enhancements, about 20 critical peak pricing experiments, about 20 with technology enhancements. And what it shows is that the more sophisticated rate and the addition of technology enhancement generally resulted in much higher levels of peak load reduction among the customers in the pilots. I think it's fair to say that in most of these pilots, they chose mostly single-family customers, and the responses would be different in the apartment sector. The uses are lower. The presence of the appliance mix is different. And so I wouldn't assume that we would replicate these kinds of results applying critical peak pricing to apartments, because most of these pilots were in the single-family sector. But the SMUD experiment did include apartment customers, and they did find that even in the apartments, customers responded in many different ways to the price signal.
Okay. We also have one other clarifying question, and then we'll get into a series of more detailed questions. On the slide with the retirements shown, the inflexible unit retirements.
Yeah.
What are the dates? So the question is, by what date are these retirements anticipated?
My recollection, and I'm not positive of this, is that these were anticipated by 2030.
Okay. Okay, great. All right, we have a lot of questions. We have pre-submitted questions, so don't feel the need to restate a question you already submitted if you submitted it when you registered. And then we also have many new questions that have been entered while Jim has been giving his presentation. There's some categories of questions that I'm going to group things into. The first one we're going to take on is related to low-income households and renting households. Second, we're going to talk about rate design. And then third, we're going to talk about costs and benefits. Fourth, load impacts. And fifth, policy. So it's a wide-ranging set of questions, and I apologize in advance if I don't get your exact question answered, but I'm trying to consolidate these so we can get representative answers. So first, with respect to low-income households, Jim, how can these strategies be useful and take advantage of participation from low-income households?
Low-income households generally have lower use than other customers, and it's not every low-income household is a low-use household, but they have a smaller complement of appliances. You don't find a lot of swimming pool pumps in the low-income sector. You don't find a lot of hot tubs in the low-income sector. You find low-income customers are more likely to live in multifamily housing. And so the things that are available are a little bit different. First of all, they don't own their appliances, and they're not likely to be able to, willing to, or have access to the capital to replace those appliances. So appliance efficiency programs that replace their appliances. Future Sound Energy, for example, offers clothes washers to older appliances.
Hey, Jim, Jim, you're breaking up a little bit.
I'm gonna switch to the other headset here.
Okay, thanks.
Am I here?
Yep, you're there.
Okay. The water heaters, 75% of apartments have electric water heaters. So providing grid-integrated water heating, and the way that program would normally, most logically be provided is either the customer's on a time-varying rate and the utility controlling their water heater to not operate unnecessarily during the high-cost hours will simply save them money. Or if the customer is not on a time-varying rate, the utility would just give the customer a $10 a month credit for subscribing to the program. And that latter approach has been used for air conditioning cycling programs in the single-family sector for a long time. But the water heating programs are ones that will be tremendous benefit to low-income customers because they're unlikely to be able to afford the new appliances. Targeted energy efficiency. Low-income programs generally are a little more expensive, but still very cost-effective when all of the costs and all of the benefits are taken into account. And so targeting low-income households for kitchen lighting or other peak-oriented uses will be beneficial. The time-varying rates will generally, but not always, generally benefit low-income households because the evidence is that air conditioning is a smaller part of low-income household usage than it is for customers. The time-varying rate is concentrating the high prices during the air conditioning hours. It will generally raise rates for customers with a lot of air conditioning use and lower bills for customers that don't have a lot of air conditioning use. And there just happens to be evidence that the low-income class has a lot less air conditioning use. Now, those are some examples.
Okay, so there's a related question about renters. Most of the strategies you listed relate to homeowners, residences, homeowners. What about renters? Are any of these strategies useful for renters?
Well, if storage air conditioning were required by appliance standards or by building codes, then renters who had air conditioning would have that as part of what's available to them. The time-varying rates, obviously, are equally applicable to renters, and I've still got the slide from SMUD illustrated here. time varying rates or demand response programs and water heating programs are all going to should be equally available to renters. In fact, probably the best place to deploy grid operator control of loads is in the multifamily sector, because one person's got the key to 50 water heaters, and they can schedule a crew to be very efficient in replacing equipment.
Okay, let's transition to rate design. We have a question from Massachusetts. Most kilowatt-based charges are not based on coincidence with peak. Isn't it better to go with the time of use plus critical peak price to drive down peak demand?
I think it does make sense, and the commercial rate design that I used as an illustration here has a pretty typical demand charge of $10 a kW based on the customer individual peak demand whenever it occurs. In fact, the only part of that demand that is relevant to the system design, which occurs right at the customer premises, it may influence the size of the transformer. Other than that, all capacity costs are incurred based on the group peak or the class peak or the circuit peak or the system peak. And the smart rate design alternative that we show on the right here gives those customers that that can limit their use during key hours and reduce the system peak and both the distribution circuit costs and the generation transmission costs a benefit if they can constrain their use during those hours.
Okay. Can you describe what, actually one follow-up, there was on the topic of how time of use and critical peak pricing affect low-income customers, and a concern that it may harm low-income customers. You said a little bit about this before. Was there anything further you wanted to say on that?
There will be low-income customers do not all have exactly the same load shape. It includes working families and retired seniors living alone, and they will have very, very different load shapes. There's a real lack of good research in this area. When utilities do research on the load patterns of low-income households, often the only sample they have to work with are those low-income customers that have signed up for the utilities' low-income assistance programs. Those tend to be the high-use low-income customers, not the seniors living alone. And so we get distorted research results often if the sample size doesn't include all low-income customers. From an appliance saturation and end-use perspective, we have pretty good data on low-income customers. They're much less likely to have a lot of air conditioning load. They're much more likely to have electric water heating load. While the electric water heating load is one that can be controlled into the off-peak periods, and they've got a lot of that, and they don't have a lot of air conditioning, and that's the one that routinely occurs during the on-peak periods. When time of use rates met 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., low-income advocates were very, very concerned about the stay-at-home seniors who were going to consume power during those hours. And that was absolutely a legitimate concern. As we're moving towards more targeted hours, where the on-peak hours might be 5 to 8 or 5 to 9 p.m., that is the neck of the duck, I think that that actually the stay-at-home seniors are going to be significant beneficiaries of a time-varying rate. Most low-income customers will be beneficiaries of time-varying rates, but because it's a large and diverse sample, there unavoidably will be, if we make 80% of them better off, we're making 20% worse off, and that's just unavoidable. with the rate design change. But I think if we reflect costs accurately and provide programs to help them adapt, energy efficiency programs, appliance replacement programs, and demand response programs such as water heater controls, we should be able to make the overwhelming majority of low-income customers better off.
Okay, great. One more rate design question before we move to another topic. How can a wholesale utility use rates and/or incentives to encourage member utilities to adopt demand response that flattens the duck curve?
There's quite a number of ways. First of all, if the utilities will shift out of demand charges and into time-varying energy rates, they will enable and encourage those utilities to do the same, or to at least concentrate the demand charges into the key hours where it really matters and limit it to the cost of peaking resources. But maybe the best example is Great River Energy, which is a generation transmission cooperative in the upper Midwest, which is the national leader at deploying grid integrated water heating. They have in the past, when they had a coal resource base, they were focused on curtailing loads during the day, and they had water heaters on simple on-off controls. But now, as they're having a much more wind-dominated supply base, they're moving these customers, they're encouraging and operating programs to move their customers to active control of the water heaters. And one of their member co-ops has even gone so far as to tell customers that if you buy a share in a community solar project, they will install for free a grid integrated water heater at your home, which allows the utility, in essence, to take the output of that solar unit and shape it into the terms of the day when it's most valuable to the entire membership of the co-op, not just to the individual customer. And I thought that's a pretty innovative program. It was all led by the G&T beginning to encourage customers to pursue load control. Charlie, you have another?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't. I had myself on mute.
Okay.
So, we're going to move to load impacts now. We're moving up to the top of the hour, so this is probably the last question before the top of the hour, but we will still be on after the top of the hour for those who wish to stay and continue with asking and answering questions. This one is the duck is mostly an artifact of the California experience, or at least that experience so far. If you were advising a jurisdiction that does not have a, quote, duck problem yet, but wants to pursue a clean distributed energy resource strategy, do you have a priority order that you would recommend for implementing these reforms?
Well, first of all, I'll take exception to the characterization of it being a California problem. It's actually a much more serious problem in Hawaii and in Germany than it is in California because they have so much more solar installed as a percentage of load in those two places. So it's present in certainly in other places. It's most well known as a California phenomenon. Certainly getting rate design shaped into time-varying periods and getting appliance standards in place. Most parts of the country, New England and the Northwest, maybe exceptions, have summer peaking loads that are driven by air conditioning. And so getting rate design that addresses that and technology that addresses that is probably a very high priority for most of the country, certainly for the South. The South has such a high level of electric water heating, that grid integrated water heating, and all of the different benefits it provides. I'm going to back up to the the Brattle report slide that showed not only peak shaving benefits, diurnal thermal storage benefits, and fast response benefits. Those fast response benefits to provide voltage support and frequency regulation may allow some older, less efficient power plants to either be retired entirely or at least put into cold standby for many, many months of the year. And that will save money, it will save fuel, it will reduce emissions. So, I guess if I were to, I'm going to back all the way up to the 10 strategies. That grid integrated water heating, storage, air conditioning, and rate design would be the, and demand response would probably be the 4 that every part of the country ought to be considering.
Okay, great. So we've reached the top of the hour, and if you have to leave now, thank you for attending today. The recording is available, so you can share this with other people, or you can review it yourself. So again, thank you if you need to go now. If not, we're going to continue with more questions. And we're still in the load impact sort of category of questions. And one question that several people were asking was if you could say more about why the west-facing PV and the solar thermal didn't pan out as well as expected. And also if you could just say, some people had a question about the west-facing PV and what exactly the impact was that you were trying to capture there.
Yeah. West-facing PV continues to produce power for about an hour or an hour and a half later in the day than south-facing PV. And there was pretty good evidence that this was going to push some of the solar production out of the morning when it was less valuable and into the late afternoon when it was most valuable. As a result of the first edition, one utility, Burbank Water and Power, actually amended its solar incentive program to limit the solar incentives to people who installed west-facing PV. And frankly, what installers had to do to comply with that was dramatically more expensive than it was really worth. When we looked at it, we said, it's only an hour to an hour and a half of benefit. We really need about a 4-hour resource. And so it's still part of the peak-oriented renewable strategy too, but we're not emphasizing it in the second edition as we did in the first. With respect to solar thermal, since the first edition, just in the last 2 years, the cost of PV solar has come down very significantly. With most recently, Palo Alto signing a contract for grid-scale solar under 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And residential scale solar has come down about 20% just in the last couple of years as the industry has become more mature. The cost of solar thermal has not come down, and frankly, solar thermal is not competing effectively in the wholesale marketplace. So it's still in there as a strategy, as part of that peak-oriented renewable strategy, but we realize that the ability to flex existing hydro generation or to seek out wind sites that had favorable wind patterns were at least as potentially valuable. So we consolidated them into a category. We did not eliminate them entirely.
Okay. We have somebody from Virginia who would love to have some statistics on where inefficiency hurts the most. So if you were to kind of flip this problem on its head and say, where are those places, HVAC, insulation, lighting, etc., where is it that allowing inefficiency to persist is exacerbating the problems you identify?
Well, RAP has a brand new publication on sort of on this topic, on how to get energy efficiency up to, more like a 30% level of loads. And it's got a discussion in that. Its title is The Next Quantum Leap in Efficiency. And I'm not sure I'm particularly qualified to answer this question, but Chris Nini, the author of that, and his group, Energy Futures Group, are experts. My own experience is we find inefficiency everywhere we look for it. Even industrial customers who insist they've done everything that's cost effective, when auditors go into their facilities, they find amazing savings. Low-income households tend to have the least attention to energy efficiency, and maybe the first place that I would look. But in places with significant air conditioning loads, I showed the slide from Texas of the residential load quadrupling on a hot day. Well, clearly in Texas, air conditioning is the place to be focused. So I think it varies from utility to utility. Our new publication addresses some of it in terms of places that we can find low-hanging fruit. So I'll recommend people take a look at The Next Quantum Leap in Efficiency.
Okay, here's a question that I'll take, Jim. There's a question here about how does transactive energy fit into what we've been discussing. And in a transactive energy world, the electric system, the distribution system operator, as well as the system operator, the wholesale system operator, are providing transparent signals of where there is value, what the grid needs in terms of services, energy, capacity, ancillary services, in different places on the grid, in different times on the grid. And the customer, as well as supply sources, have the opportunity to bid into a market, into a transactive market, to meet those needs. So, a natural extension of a lot of these approaches that Jim has described, will become a part of the resources that become bid into a transactive energy market as that is developed. That's still in the development stage at this point in time. So I would say that these strategies are consistent with a transactive energy future and are just waiting for technology, transparency in markets to enable more active interaction from demand-side resources directly or through aggregators to meet grid needs of different sorts. Next question, Jim. How will behind-the-meter energy storage impact the duck curve, particularly in the commercial and industrial sector?
Well, first of all, I have to define behind-the-meter storage. I will include behind-the-meter storage as managing the strategies 3, 4, 5, and 7 here. With grid-integrated water heating being a form of behind-the-meter thermal storage, same with storage air conditioning, water utilities that can run their pumps in the middle of the day when the sun is shining or the middle of the night when the wind is blowing and let gravity do the work the rest of the time, have a form of storage. My guess is that the questionnaire was directed at electricity storage, like batteries. I think it will have some impact, but not very much because it's expensive. If the costs continue to come down as they have, I think it could change the industry quite dramatically. If battery storage costs come down an order of magnitude in 10 years, the way that solar costs have come down an order of magnitude, it could be quite a dramatic impact. We focused on electricity storage that can do double duty. For example, my local hospital has a battery storage system, uninterruptible power supply for their 5 surgical suites. They have recently realized that the surgical suites almost entirely get used in the morning, and those batteries are typically hardly ever used. They've started peak shaving in the afternoon to reduce their demand charge with those batteries. If they had a critical peak energy charge rather than a demand charge rate form, they would be using those batteries to peak shave at hours that are most important to the grid. So right now they're responding to a relatively clumsy price signal and a demand charge, and doing so in a way that saves them money. And if the rate design were smarter, they would respond in a also to save themselves money, but in a manner that would be more beneficial to the grid. But unless and until costs come down significantly, and it's quite possible they will, I don't see electricity storage as a big part of it. We use electricity storage for 1% reduction of the peak demand and a 1% increase in the off-peak demand for our illustrative utility.
Okay. Here's our last question about load impact, and then we'll move on to benefits and costs. This person asks, for all technologies studied, the question arose to them during your water heater discussion. How does the kilowatt hour usage change with kilowatt management? That is, for example, do the times of lower draw cancel out the times of higher draw for overall energy consumption?
That's an outstanding question, and it really varies from technology to technology. With water pumping, there's very little difference. With water heating, there's very little difference. With air conditioning, it's quite a different story. What Ice Energy has found is that by operating the chillers at night, they're actually making the ice when the outside air is cooler and the heat rejection of the chillers is better. And they're getting about a 15% net reduction in kilowatt hour usage by using storage air conditioning. That was contrary to what some people were thinking. They were thinking that having to go through a phase change from water to ice and back to water would consume energy and the kilowatt hours would go up, but that's more than offset by the reduction, by the improved heat rejection at night. Now, but I did a little bit more study on this in water heating, because one of the issues when I looked at the water heaters in the condos for Maui is that we were going to heat the water a little hotter, so that and then use a blending valve to make sure nobody gets scalded in order to sort of increase the thermal storage capacity of the tank. And if you heat the water hotter, then there's more, it's called the delta T, more temperature differential between the air outside the tank and the water inside the tank, and the thermal loss from the tank is increased. Now, with a modern water heater, that's a very low level of loss, but it's still higher at 140 degrees than it is at 120. But I also did a paper several years ago on the effect of energy efficiency on line losses. And line losses are highest at peak hours on the grid. And what I calculated for the water heaters is that higher storage temperatures would mean about 2% more energy consumption for heating water. But doing it during off-peak hours rather than on-peak hours would result in about 3% reduction in the line losses incurred in getting those kilowatt hours to the water tank. So they roughly equaled each other out. A little higher thermal loss from the tank, but significantly lower line losses getting power to the premises by doing it at off-peak hours. So my guess is that for water pumping and water heating, the net effect is close to zero, and for air conditioning, it should be quite significantly positive.
Okay, so I'm gonna read you 3 questions that all have to do with costs and benefits. So I think you can answer at once. How do you assess the cost of these strategies, and who would bear the costs versus the benefits? And if so, what have you found? Second, are the costs of teaching the duck to fly justified by the benefits, and who should pay for these costs? And third, if the objective is not to maximize load reduction, but rather to reduce load only when it costs more, then shouldn't the optimal rate design, real-time pricing, be the most cost-effective solution?
A great set of questions for which there's probably no adequate answer. I'll start at the end. Real-time pricing is typically based on short-run marginal costs, and when those short-run marginal costs are very, very high at critical peak hours, it's important to reflect them. But most economists believe that rate design should generally reflect long-run marginal costs, and real-time pricing for all but the critical peak hours is probably the wrong strategy. There's not unanimity in the profession about that. As far as measuring the costs and the benefits, well, you know, for grid integrated water heating, it's about $20 to install the control circuitry into a water heater if it's done at the factory. It might be $200 to do it on a retrofit basis. And for that, you get a knowable amount of peak load reduction and a knowable amount of thermal storage benefits of we'll call them energy arbitrage, moving load from high-cost hours into low-cost hours. And the cost-effectiveness calculation is relatively straightforward for that type of a resource. For electricity storage that's doing double duty or triple duty, obviously the cost of that electricity storage needs to be, in case of Kauai, apportioned between the load shifting function from day to night, the renewable integration function of providing very real-time second-to-second adaptation to varying output of the solar resources compared to having to manage that with control of other power plants. And then the third is the spinning reserve, and that would be compared to the cost of keeping conventional power, building conventional power plants to perform that function, and then running fuel through them inefficiently in order to have them in a position to provide spinning reserves. And so, you know, it's a much more complex economic calculation, but not an impossible one. The key, and we have a paper on this also, is to make sure that you're considering all of the costs and all of the benefits. And our paper, we call it our layer cake paper, recognizing the full value of energy efficiency, looks at that for energy efficiency measures. But the same thing needs to be done for any other measure. For example, if a water utility moves its water pumping loads into off-peak hours but increases the size of its reservoir, it may be improving its reliability of service. Whereas if it moves its water pumping load into the morning and evening or into off-peak hours without increasing the size of its reservoir, it may be reducing its reliability of service. And so there's both a cost, dollar cost, and there's a reliability cost to be considered. That becomes a fairly complex calculation. All in all, now with wind and solar resources coming to utilities at prices that we never dreamed we would see, even a few years ago, Is it cost effective to do things to align loads to resources and resources to loads? I think the answer when people study it is overwhelmingly yes, as opposed to building conventional power plants that are only used for a few hours on a few days of the year. But these are generally economical strategies.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So now we're going to shift. There was one more cost question I stumbled into, and you answered it in the course of your answer, which was comparing it with the cost of simple cycle gas units. So I'm moving on to the policy area. First, somebody has one load or one strategy that they want to throw onto the table, and wanted to get your reaction to this. Do you see any role for deep energy retrofits and DC microgrids?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I don't know either the deep energy retrofit economics or the microgrid technologies well enough to really constructively answer. Let me go back to the one on comparing to the cost of a simple cycle turbine. Just on the capital cost, a simple cycle turbine is maybe installed $800 a kilowatt. Plus you need distribution capacity to get it to the customer, and it's going to be pumping power into the grid at a time when marginal line losses may be 20%, maybe higher than that. By contrast, each water heater that you can remotely control has a 4.4 kW element. There's about a 10% probability, 15% probability that that particular water heater will be online when you ask it to turn off. So you're going to get about half a kW of load relief from one water heater. And if it's 20 bucks installed at the factory or 200 bucks on a retrofit basis, then it's between $40 and $400 to get a kW of capacity by controlling water heaters versus $800 a kW just for the generating unit for a simple cycle unit. So it's, between 1/20th and 1/2 of the capital cost, and dramatically, essentially zero operating cost versus a simple cycle turbine has significant operating costs. Are you muted, Carl?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. Sorry about that. What role do you foresee for distributed energy resources in comparison to centralized solutions, and which bottlenecks must be overcome to leverage both? Did that make sense?
Well, it does. I'd kind of like everybody in RAP to have a chance of answering that question. It's as broad as it comes. Clearly, the load shape and reliability impacts have to be number one. This is a country where people expect first world electric service, and things that compromise reliability are really not going to be acceptable. I think we have the tools that neither distributed nor central renewables should have any reason to impair reliability, but we've got to move ahead. The question that I would ask almost any utility is, do you have control of 3/4 of your water heating load? Do you have 3/4 of your air conditioning in some kind of storage or cycling program? Do you have 3/4 of your municipal water and wastewater pumping loads operating in synchronization with the grid's needs rather than putting burdens on them? I would start with those as places where if a utility is not doing those things, then it's not doing a very good job adapting to either a central or distributed renewable world, and it's putting the reliability of service for its customers at risk. I think rate design is going to make a huge difference on whether distributed generation continues to proliferate. Clearly, in Hawaii, they've now ended their net metering program, and the customers that are adding solar at this point are getting much lower compensation during the middle of the solar day because the grid really doesn't have a need for energy then. And when they're taking power from the grid at night, they're paying much higher prices for it. This will either slow the development of distributed solar or accelerate the deployment of distributed storage to allow these customers to use, in essence, use their own energy if it's cost effective to provide storage. But rate design will have a very huge impact on guiding what kinds of resources we choose in the future.
Okay, I think we've about come to the end of our time. Jim, do you have any final comments you want to make or any points you want to emphasize before we say goodbye for today?
Well, most important, I want to thank the entire energy community, and including many of the people on this call, for the comments that we received on the first edition of Teaching the Duck to Fly. It's, I think, the first time that RAP has ever issued a revised edition of one of our publications. We're in the process of doing that now for a couple of others. But it was very encouraging to me, the quantity and quality of feedback that we received, not only through webinars and presentations, but also written communications that I've gotten directly or that have come through the RAP Vermont office. We've made tremendous progress in various parts of the country. These strategies have been cited by regulatory commissions in a number of decisions. The first edition was cited in regulatory decisions in Hawaii and regulatory decisions in Europe as providing guidance for how we can start looking at ways to adapt loads to resources and resources to loads. So the feedback is always helpful, and I hope that everybody who's participated in this call, who's got the comment, will make sure that you go onto our website and find the links to our emails and let us know. I'm going to scroll forward here so that my email is showing here. I've got a ways to go.
So while Jim is doing that, just thank each one of you for attending today, for your questions, your participation. The recording of this will be posted, the slide deck will be posted, and so we encourage you to look back on it and share it with your friends. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks.